Reuters says the U.S. and Iran have agreed on a text, and Washington expects a signature within days. In the same week, Israel is striking Beirut's southern suburbs. If you're just joining us, U.S.-Iran talks have kept moving through Gulf mediation even as the war widened, with Qatari envoys going to Tehran after consulting Washington. The package on the table is sanctions relief, nuclear commitments, and regional de-escalation, all under pressure from military exchanges and the Strait of Hormuz blockade, which is pushing both sides towards some kind of off-ramp.
This is Iran War Daily. Today, a one-page memo, tested before the ink's even dry by 3 deaths in Dahiya, plus what the Hormuz numbers actually say. Let's start with the document everybody's about to sign and nobody can verify.
Let's start with the structure. Reuters reports an agreed text, with signing expected within days, but I want to know who exactly is signing. If this is a foreign ministry instrument and the Supreme Leader's office hasn't blessed it, the authority gap is the story.
Right, because Arachi doesn't command the guys hitting Lebanon. So who inside Iran actually signs on? IRGC? The leader's office? Until that's named, a text is a press release with a stapler.
And the step-back point gets to the hole in this thing: compliance verification. The IAEA's June 4th reports already raised questions about the 60% enriched material. If inspectors can't see the stockpiles now, what does a signature verify?
Nothing. You're signing an annex with a blank where the enrichment accounting goes. That's the middle of the agreement, and it's missing. And here's the live test. Lebanon's NNA says Israel struck Dahiya on June 14, killing 3. The memo's days from signing, and the ground's already moving the other way.
Right. And here's what the memo doesn't settle, Rich. Neither track, the memo or the nuclear file, says whether Israel's Lebanon campaign pauses, continues, or is even on the table.
So what happens when an allied militia or Israel keeps fighting the week the deals sign? The text has to answer for those 3 deaths in Beirut, and it doesn't.
I'd narrow that a bit. The diplomatic track really did move this week, from a ceasefire rupture to an agreed text. But it's running into confirmed strikes through the weekend. The de-escalation is real, and it's badly incomplete.
Then let's get off the he said, she said on Hormuz. That CETA analysis from April actually has numbers on what a blockade does: supply shock, war risk premiums, rerouting volumes.
Which is the value of it? An independent baseline from before this week's claims. You can measure Tehran's "we've closed it" against Washington's "traffic's moving," instead of just restating both.
Exactly. Does that supply shock figure square with the 132-ship redirect we cited June 11? That's the test. Insurance and rerouting tells you whether the strait's open in any way that matters, regardless of what either capital says. If you want to keep up with U.S.-Iran deal negotiations, tap follow so the next episode lands in your feed.
From NBC News.
Jerusalem, Beirut. Israel said its military attacked Hezbollah targets in Beirut's southern suburbs on Sunday after the Lebanese armed group fired into Israeli territory, and Lebanon's Civil Defense Ministry said 3 people were killed. The Israeli military said earlier that Hezbollah had launched 3 projectiles towards communities in northern Israel, calling it a blatant ceasefire violation.
Here's what we know from Sunday. Israel says it struck Hezbollah targets in Dahiya after the group fired 3 projectiles into northern Israel. Lebanon's Civil Defense Ministry puts the dead at 3. NNA says the strike hit an apartment, with 2 killed and 4 wounded.
So in the same week, Reuters says Washington and Tehran have an agreed text. 3 people are dead in a Beirut apartment building. That's the gap, right there.
And notice, neither side is being shy about authorship here. Israel calls it a blatant ceasefire violation and names Hezbollah as the trigger. This is a tit-for-tat with a clear sequence on the record.
Right, but here's what a one-page memo can't solve. Arachi doesn't fire those projectiles. Dahiya is Hezbollah's ground. You can sign all the text you want in Doha, The people shooting weren't in the room.
Let's be precise. Dahiyeh is a dense residential district, a Hezbollah stronghold per NBC, and it's been hit repeatedly. So an apartment strike there is both a claimed military target and civilian housing in the same square block.
When officials say the U.S. and Iran are close to a one-page memo to end the war, what would make that more than a handshake? Who has to sign on? How do you verify compliance? And what happens if Israel or an allied militia keeps fighting?
Short answer, a lot has to go right at once, and the structure is thin right now. Per Reuters, both sides have agreed on a text, and Washington expects to sign an initial deal within days. But Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was still saying Friday that changes were possible. CBS News, citing two regional officials, says the draft memo centers on a 60-day ceasefire extension, a commitment to end military operations on every front, including Lebanon, and Iran affirming it won't develop nuclear weapons and will dispose of its enriched uranium stockpile. Iran has also agreed in principle to reopen the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for the U.S. lifting its blockade on Iranian ports and ships. That's the economic pressure point both sides need to resolve fast. But the CFR flagged the core problem. Neither government has shared the full terms publicly. Trump said he wasn't, quote, 100% certain a deal would happen, and the MOU, as described by Al Jazeera, still needed Trump's final approval as of late May. On verification, the draft's nuclear provisions would presumably require IAEA access. We just don't have that mechanism publicly confirmed in any of the sourcing, which is a warning sign for how much is still unresolved.
What about Israel? Does it have any formal role in this deal, or can it just keep striking Iran regardless of what gets signed?
No one has cleanly answered that. The draft, per CBS News, commits to ending operations on every front, including Lebanon. But Israel isn't a signatory to a U.S.-Iran MOU. And the BBC noted back in April that many issues were still unresolved, even as ceasefire talks were starting under Pakistani mediation. What I'm watching for is explicit language binding Israel, or at least publicly pressuring it, and a defined IAEA inspection timeline for the uranium stockpile. Without those two things, this memo stays closer to a handshake than a durable halt. From Foundation for Political, Economic, and Social Research.
The Strait of Hormuz is a critical choke point through which approximately one-fifth of the world's maritime oil and liquefied natural gas, LNG supply, flows to various markets. Following the war initiated by the United States and Israel against Iran, the blockade that began in the Strait of Hormuz on March 1, 2026, has brought daily tanker transits, which previously averaged between 50 and 60, to a virtual standstill, driving oil prices into an upward and volatile trend.
Here's the number I've been waiting for someone to put on paper. CETA's analysis, published April 8th, says the Hormuz blockade that started March 1st took daily tanker transits from 50-60 a day down to a virtual standstill. And they're blunt about why it bites differently. Compared with the 2020 demand collapse or the 2022 Russia gas squeeze that mostly hit Europe, CETA calls this an unprecedented disruption. One-fifth of the world's seaborne oil and LNG runs through that gap.
The baseline is what matters here. We've spent the week with Tehran saying, "We have closed it," and Washington saying, "Traffic is moving." This gives you an independent measure of what a genuine closure does to prices, not just the he said, she said.
Right. So when a one-page memo gets signed within days, that's the ledger it has to answer to. The supply shock is documented. The signature is a press release until it moves a tanker.
One caveat on dates. CETA is describing conditions from a March to April window. It frames what closure costs. It doesn't confirm what's transiting Hormuz this week.
If you value clear daily briefings on fast-moving crises, try Ebola Watch, a weekday briefing on the DRC and Uganda Ebola outbreaks, covering case counts, border tracing, WHO vaccine news, and traveler guidance. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be watching whether the draft memo clears its remaining political hurdles. with Washington expecting an initial U.S.-Iran deal to be signed within days if it does. You'll find links to every story we covered today in the show notes, so if one story stood out, you can follow it there. That's Iran War Daily for today. This is a Lantern podcast.